If you're autistic like me, you'll be well aware that we are not born with the social skills that neurotypical people are born with. You watch them at parties and just generally around the place. You watch the way they get along with people and they seem so effortless. And let's not forget, they were not taught these skills. They were born with them. And if you, like me, watch them do that and go, wow, look, I don't think I could ever do that. Well, you're half right. What I mean by this is I don't believe we'll ever be able to do it the way they do it. That's the point. But we can learn to socialise and we can learn influencing people and just things more harmonious, but not in the way that we instinctively try to. So we go to a party or an outing of some sort. If we try to do it their way, it's incredibly exhausting. You're just constantly monitoring yourself. Should I say this? Should I not say that? Not really knowing what to do and watching them effortlessly do it. But there are some simple things that we can do. Now, I'm someone who worked in sales for over 20 years and did not know I was autistic. And back in the 90s, I read this book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. I know it sounds very corny, but it's the very first self-help book that was ever sold in like the 30s by Dale Carnegie. And this episode is dedicated to the first chapter, which is entitled, If You Want Honey, Don't Kick Over the Beehive. It's no secret that us autistic people have a tendency to point out mistakes or faults that other people make. And it doesn't go down very well. And I think the mistake, I can at least speak in my case, the mistake I make is believing, well, if that was me, I'd want to know that I've done X and Y incorrectly, because a lot of us approach the world from not wanting to be right, but wanting the truth of something. And so whenever somebody has said to me, oh, you're saying that, using that word incorrectly, or whatever it is, you're doing that thing the wrong way, even if they've said it in a poor way, I'm so much driven by wanting the truth, wanting the correctness, that I'm willing to not worry about the way that the message was delivered. And when we do that, so we're correcting, we're doing it as a place of love. We want it to be helpful to the person. But if you're doing it to either a neurotypical person or an autistic that's masking, so they've learnt to respond the way a neurotypical does, or they've taught that, oh, when someone corrects you, it's bad for some reason, it can not go down very well at all. Then we've got, when you go low, I go lower. I have in the past been very, very guilty of this, and it still occasionally pops up in my mind as an appropriate way to handle something. And it's really not. But what it is called offending from the victim position. Now, this is not an autistic thing, but it's just something that people do, that we are wronged by somebody and then now we feel justified in retaliating and doing something equally bad or worse back to the person. Then we've got candor or radical honesty, which a lot of people attribute as a normal way for an autistic person to communicate with others. It's not always the case. I've never been that way, but I have known people, undiagnosed ones, but I'm pretty sure were autistic, that had that way of communicating where they would just blurt out the first thing that was on their mind. One of them was my ex-girlfriend, my first ever girlfriend. And, I hadn't seen her for many years, but she lives in my mum's hometown, and she saw my mother and asked her something like, is he still breeding? That's what my mum told me. It sounded like something she would say. But her way of communicating was, oh, I've got something to say, and if that person doesn't like it, that's their problem, which is fine. But when someone did the same thing to her, she didn't like it. Although candor and radical honesty in itself isn't a problem, the reason I'm bringing it up here is that it's often weaponized. If you've ever heard someone say something and you think, wow, that was offensive, but then when someone calls them out, they say, oh, I'm just being honest. while they're obviously weaponizing it, because candor isn't meant to be that. It's not a weapon. And anything, any therapy or any skills that you can learn anywhere can be weaponized if you want them to. I'm coming from a place of not doing that. And so therefore, if you candor should be true, just being true and saying something that's true. But in this case, I believe that it should really be reserved for those that are going to receive it well, or other autistic people. That's really what my recommendation is. Again, we're trying to learn better ways at communicating so that we're not misunderstood or that we don't get the other person's back up. And what's the real downside of this is if we do point out people's faults, or if we're really super honest, whichever way you want to label it, that they will respond in a very, very defensive manner. And one example in the book that he talks about is an example of this gangster who was known as Two Guns Crowley. I'd never heard of him until I read in this book. And he was I can't remember if he was shot or captured by the police, but before all this took place, he was sitting there writing a letter basically defending himself over his actions, and he was claiming that he was a kind soul and he would never do anyone any harm or something like that. But that morning, he'd gunned down a police officer for asking for his license and registration, and then used the officer's gun on himself as well. And this same guy's saying, "Oh, I would do nobody any harm." Really crazy defensiveness. And is it any surprise that people don't respond well when they're criticised? Another example I can think of more now that's relevant these days, I see lots of videos on social media like Instagram, or when I was on TikTok it was there as well. It's probably still there. And people would be, calling out conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers, any anti-science things people say, and they're calling them out, and sometimes they're calling them stupid, or sometimes they're just simply implying, "Oh, look at how stupid you are for doing that." And although I'm watching these videos and going, yeah, this is true, what this guy's person, these people do say these things and what have you, I sit there and think, but the people that you're talking about are not going to change their minds. They're not going to watch this video or hear someone else say the same thing and go, "What? You know what? You're right. I will. Now I'll believe science is real," or whatever. Now I'll believe the earth isn't flat. That's not how it really works. Now, I do realise that I'm saying everything in a negative, as in, don't do this, don't do this. And for the most part, I realise that that's not particularly helpful, because you need to be told. We need to know what to do, not what not to do. But in this case, I think it's very relevant, because unlike being told if you're on a ladder, don't look down, which mine tells you, all you hear is look down. In this case, it's like avoid this thing that you currently do, that I often do myself. Just, okay, let's move away from that, and don't see that as an attractive option for solving the problems. What do you do instead? Now, I'm stealing this from Gottman Therapy, and one of these things I stole from is their 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. One of the big 4 things that will predict a failing relationship, one of them is criticizing your partner. It's a huge, huge predictor of potentially your relationship will fail if you do this. And their solution is what they call gentle startup. And you think about what that might mean. What does it mean for you? But at the end of the day, it's not, "Oh, you didn't do this, it didn't do that." There's a gentle way of going about this. And so ways that gentle startup can look like is using I statements and very much sticking to the facts, not exaggerating. Don't say you always, or see, I've used you there. So avoid that. Talk about yourself or how you feel. But most importantly, as I said, be careful to stick to the facts. So like what Vicky Tidwell Palmer talks about is, describe what you can film with a video camera. So if you imagine literally filming, uploading it to AI and saying, "What do you see here with a particular situation?" Like, the dishes aren't done. That's the fact. The dishes are not done. And it wouldn't be wise to start with, you didn't do the dishes. You've used a you statement. Or you might say, you never did the dishes, which might not be true either. They might have just not done them today. And so those two things alone I definitely have found to be helpful. So today we've talked about the different styles of communication between autistic and neurotypical people, as well as to acknowledge to ourselves why we do some of the things we do. We prefer honesty, we prefer directness a lot of the time, and therefore we think other people will receive it well, and they may not. Quite likely they're not going to. Handy to know that's what's going on, I believe. And talking about the criticism and what effect that has. Not only do they not hear what we've said, they're quite likely to become defensive. And the way around that, I'm naming it and I've just given a brief description of it, but being gentle with your startup. And sometimes you need to pick your battles. Is it something you really need to say as well? You might think, does it really matter in the big scheme of things? Because sometimes this is what it comes down to. It can be, what's more important is getting what you want, maintaining the relationship out of those two things. And sometimes it's worth thinking about that before we say something to another person. And just to reiterate, I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm just someone who, through 20-year career of sales and been 30 years as an adult, of learning all of these things that I've had to pick up, and I've found them incredibly useful in my life. And not only that, I've found that they're skills that even neurotypical people tend not to use. So I hope that is helpful. And if you've got any questions about anything I've said here, if I've not answered something or if I didn't elaborate, you want some more information on anything I've said, please pop it down in the comments below. And if you've got a story about this where you've implemented something, you've taken a skill you've learned and you've found, oh, look, wow, other people around me are not using this. Yeah, I'd like to hear about that as well. Otherwise, take care out there.